Definitely a bunch of old bottles in here. Does alcohol go bad?
It only improves. It's all good, Alex.
Russell, you're breaking up.
The vodka
Some of
discovered it,
our
Alex.
earliest experiments on the project involved placing old Half-Life 2 models in a level and walking around them in VR. These included static models of enemies, like Combine soldiers or zombies. We found that players really enjoyed being able to inspect these models, because VR let them get much closer than they'd been able to in the past. Players reported getting a sense of the true size of the characters, and would often point out details that they had never noticed before, even though they had seen these models many times throughout Half-Life 2. These reactions led us to the idea of creating an enemy that took advantage of that experience, one that required players to spend long periods of time in close physical proximity to it. But enemies typically don't let the player get near them without attacking, so we felt it made fictional sense for this enemy to be blind, and to feature non-combat gameplay as its focus. Early experiments with guiding a blind creature using sounds were immediately interesting, and gave us a way to create scenarios unique to the product. Thus, the concept for Jeff, known as the blind zombie internally, was born.
The Zen flora you see on the wall here, which we refer to as Zen ears for obvious reasons, animate in reaction to the same sounds as Jeff. Early in development, we would observe situations where playtesters would fail to notice Jeff becoming enraged by a sound. If the player died as a result, they felt frustrated and wronged. We worked to make Jeff's animations and sounds communicate his level of aggression to the player as clearly as possible. But if players weren't looking at Jeff, they could still be caught unaware. Adding these Zen ear growths to the environment was a way for us to help players be more aware of Jeff's reactions to sound. The Zen ears work as an extra layer of visual feedback for Jeff's behavioral state, one that lives in the environment instead of on Jeff himself.
Alex, come in, Alex. Alex? Oh, there you are, there you are.
There's no straight shot to the vault. I'm gonna head inside and find a way out.
Alex, you're never gonna believe...
Right from the beginning of development, we intended to feature a variety of visually distinct Zen flora and fauna in Half-Life Alyx. But we didn't yet know how these visual elements would be used to craft interesting gameplay. Referred to internally as Zen clams, the Zen plants you would see here were originally built to add visual flavor to the world and were only lightly interactive. They would track the player's head and hands and would close tight if the player got too close. When we began working on Jeff, we wanted to find surprising new ways to use sound as a core gameplay mechanic. In particular, we wanted to make players wary of the environment around them. We realized we could use the Zen clams as a type of noise hazard by having them repeatedly snap open and shut when approached by the player. We had already placed these clams in earlier parts of the game, which meant that players would reach the distillery with an understanding of how they functioned. The introduction of Jeff changed the player's relationship with the Zen clams, as they went from being harmless but annoying to a dangerous hazard that players would need to take care to avoid.
Hey, you with the blood on you. You with the blood.
Early versions of the distillery explored a variety of methods for subtlety, teaching players how Jeff works without any explicit exposition. Though some of the training techniques were quite successful, anything less than a complete understanding of Jeff's behavior resulted in players bungling their way through this section of the game and having a terrible time doing it. Eventually, we determined that explicit training was necessary, and that's where the character of Larry came in. Larry acts as a gate, delivering critical information about Jeff's behavior before allowing the player to proceed. It's a dense learning environment and a delicate balancing act, ensuring that we deliver the rules of Jeff while still making Larry an interesting character. To spread out the exposition, you'll notice that it's distributed over a few different story beats as Larry first introduces Jeff, then demonstrates Jeff's predictable reaction to a breaking bottle, and finally explains that the player can prevent their own coughing on Zen spores by covering their mouth.
Watch this. See? He's totally predictable. But he will rip your arms off if he finds you. Hey, those things are nasty. You gotta cover your mouth.
Got it. Thanks.
Hey, I almost forgot. What's your name?
Alex. Alex Vance.
Hey, Alex, I'm Larry. Nice to meet you. Try not to get killed.
A core element of both the environment and Jeff himself are the Zen plants seen here spewing toxic gas that makes the player cough. These were not created to be merely ornamental or to support the novel VR interaction of players covering their mouth. They were added specifically to solve a long-standing challenge that we had with illustrating Jeff's personal space. One of the trickier aspects of designing Jeff was striking the right balance between perceived threat and actual threat. Many scenarios in the level forced the player into close proximity with Jeff in order to create tension. We found that these moments could be exciting, but they could also become frustrating when players accidentally got too close to Jeff and were killed unexpectedly. Players reported not understanding how close is too close. We tried a number of solutions, such as adding glowing tentacles to Jeff that acted as a visual representation of the perimeter of his personal space. Touch the tentacles, and you die. Getting the look and feel of these tentacles to a satisfactory place proved challenging, however, and we backed away from the idea. Another problem we encountered was that a subset of our players quickly became comfortable around Jeff once they became adept at keeping their distance from him and avoiding sources of noise. For these players, dealing with Jeff felt trivial. He simply didn't feel like a threat to them. We discussed a variety of potential solutions to these problems, even wacky concepts, such as giving Jeff the ability to teleport to sources of noise. But it was difficult to come up with ideas that didn't feel like we were giving Jeff the ability to cheat. Eventually, we came up with the idea of having the player cough. This was appealing, as it gave us a way to make the player themselves a source of noise, thus causing Jeff to pursue them. We were also interested in making the environment more dangerous generally, and so our first experiments with coughing involved littering the level with Zen plants spewing toxic gas. Initial tests showed a lot of promise. Players now felt like Jeff was a dangerous pursuer, and they must carefully observe the environment to avoid the gas. We observed that players had a natural instinct to cover their mouth with their hand to suppress their cough. This was an affordance that VR with tracked hand controllers supported very naturally, so we implemented this mechanic right away. This still left us with the problem of players being unsure of how close they could safely get to Jeff. We realized that the earlier experiment of adding tentacles to Jeff could be replaced with a much simpler approach of attaching a toxic cloud directly to him. There were multiple benefits to this. First, it gave players visual feedback for how far they needed to stay away from Jeff to be safe. Second, it made those times when Jeff did get close all the more tense, with players now needing to commit a hand to covering their mouth. Finally, we didn't need to teach the players anything new. They could carry forward what they had already learned about toxic gas in the environment and apply those lessons to Jeff himself.
One of our major goals in the design of Half-Life Alyx was to reach the widest possible audience. This meant developing for all of the major VR hardware in the market, as well as accommodating different-sized play spaces, traversal preferences, and so on. The accessibility option that had the most knock-on effects into the design of the game, from controller bindings, to game logic, to level design, was the support of a single controller mode for players who don't use two controllers. In this mode, reloading is performed by moving the weapon to the shoulder and pressing a button, much like arcade games which require the player to fire their weapon off-screen to reload. The flashlight was modified to attach to the primary hand, and gas masks were added so that players could muffle their coughs hands-free. Even the gun used in the final Strider battle, with its two-handed aiming and reloading controls, was modified to be operable with one hand.
As we refined Jeff's behavior and visual design, we thought a lot about how we wanted players to feel about him. The goal was to have playtesters describe Jeff with words such as menacing, threatening, and deadly, and for that reason it became important that players not survive if they got too close to Jeff. So we decided that his attack should result in instant death. This would teach players unambiguously that Jeff was too dangerous to trifle with, but it left us with the challenge of teaching this to players without necessarily killing them. The approach we took was to give the player opportunities to witness Jeff attack and kill other characters. Early versions of the level included scenarios where Jeff and the player would encounter zombies and Combine soldiers. The player could attack these enemies, or use sound to lure Jeff into place so that he could pummel them with his massive arms. This gave players an opportunity to witness Jeff's power and his method of attack without dying at his hands themselves. Unfortunately, this outcome wasn't guaranteed, as some players would opt to kill those enemies themselves, and having these other characters present was also quite expensive in terms of animation, sound, and level content. We were already grappling with the challenge of keeping this level well-paced and within scope, and so we cut these sections. But this still left us with the original problem of how to demonstrate Jeff's ability to kill without killing the player. We chose to address this by adding beats to existing animated sequences. For example, when the player opens this two-handed roller door, we added a head crab for Jeff to munch on in full view of the player. We also added a similar beat to the later elevator ride, with Jeff smashing a head crab against a wall before melting it down with acid.
Even though Larry instructs the player on the basics of how Jeff works, we found that we needed to let players test those rules without having Jeff in their immediate personal space. If we made players first interact with Jeff face to face, they often fell to pieces and forgot the rules. They would die over and over again, and their fear of Jeff would quickly turn into frustration and annoyance. This area was created to serve as a training playground, where players can observe Jeff reacting to various sounds while remaining safe from his attacks. It contains many of the elements that are encountered throughout the rest of the level, including some falling bottles, a padlock that needs to be shot, and various types of Zen plants. Jeff remains close enough to feel threatening, but he cannot attack the player. Players can spend as much time here as they need to, and move on when they feel like they've got a good grip on how Jeff works.
Jeff's character design went through several significant revisions over the course of development. Just by looking at him, we wanted players to understand certain things about the character. Our first priority was to communicate his blindness. Second, we wanted the character to feel physically imposing. After all, the entire concept of Jeff had grown out of our observation that just being close to a character in VR could make for a powerful experience. Finally, we wanted players to understand the blind zombie's behavioural state at a glance. Is he feeling angry? Did he just hear something and is feeling curious? And so on. The first design that we modelled and animated was a sort of Combine worker robot. The robot's face featured a holographic display that could flip between different icons that represented its state. A large piece of rebar jutted out of the back of the robot's head, sparking electricity and spewing smoke. This was meant to demonstrate that its visual sensors were impaired, making it blind. We made the robot tall and hulking. It looked heavy, unpredictable and dangerous. However, player reactions to this robotic design showed that it had problems. Players would initially focus on the head's holographic display. Parsing the face and understanding the meaning of the icons proved too challenging for players, and even worse, this element distracted from the rebar poking through the robot's head, and their understanding that it was blind. Players found the robot imposing, but we weren't getting the deeply visceral reaction of fear that was desired. A trip back to the drawing board landed us with the more organic character you see in front of you. Drawing inspiration from the idea of coal miners succumbing to the black lung, we focused on the concept of a member of the Combine's Zen cleanup crew that had succumbed to the Zen infection. This gave us the visceral reaction from players which we were looking for. A human face is still visible, but the eyes are clearly decayed, communicating blindness. The organic nature of this design allowed us to lean more heavily on audio to feed back the behavioural state, with animalistic grunts and roars that came to include more human-sounding elements over time.
Puzzles are a useful design tool, since they force players to move around the environment and also occupy their primary hand via use of the multi-tool. In this area, the player has to aim their flashlight to navigate, point their offhand to teleport, cover their mouth to prevent coughing, follow wires with the multi-tool, and potentially pull bottles with their gravity gloves. The player has to make trade-offs as they proceed, since their two hands are overcommitted by design. One-handed players are even more overwhelmed by these many tasks. This is why we littered the distillery with gas masks the player can attach to their mouth, so they won't have to use a hand to muffle their cough. This toner puzzle went through several revisions, many of which left Jeff free to roam while players worked on the puzzle. But this resulted in players having to juggle too many elements at once, and their fear of Jeff quickly turned into frustration. The solution was to keep Jeff locked up while players solved the puzzle, with his distant roars maintaining a level of tension. We were then left with the problem of how to release Jeff so the level could continue. Initial ideas involved having Jeff break out from the freezer on his own when the puzzle was complete, but this felt contrived and scripted compared to having the player free Jeff from the freezer. The toner puzzle mechanic gave us a logical solution to this problem, with the added benefit of creating a moment of high tension for the player when they realize they're going to have to open the freezer door and release Jeff in order to proceed.
Many Many of our ideas for Jeff involved coming up with plausible ways to force Jeff and the player to occupy an enclosed space at the same time. An elevator ride was on the table from the beginning, but we were unsure of how successful it would be in execution. There was also a concern that such a sequence could be technically expensive to pull off. Our first prototype was extremely rudimentary. Players would get into an elevator with Jeff, the ride would last around 30 seconds, and then Jeff and the player would exit. There was no complicated level scripting, no bespoke animations for Jeff, and no special audio or lighting treatment. Despite the relative lack of polish, players had a strong positive reaction to the sequence, even naming it a highlight of the game when we ran company-wide playtests. This convinced us that it was worth putting more work into the elevator ride to make it something really special. In the end, a lot of different disciplines came together to create the final sequence, which combines sound, animation, scripted lighting, and careful choreography of Jeff's movements and the player's actions.
Most of the time, the noises that attract Jeff are created by the player, who is either actively trying to lure him to a new location, or has perhaps made a noisy mistake that could have been avoided. The key point being that the player feels some amount of responsibility for the noises being made. The goal of the upcoming hallway was to flip that idea on its head, if only for a moment. Like a misbehaving pet, this cheeky headcrab appears to surprise and infuriate the player, clumsily knocking over a series of bottles before escaping into a vent. Classic headcrab nonsense. We were surprised to find that many players wanted to check and see if the headcrab had indeed escaped. They would climb up onto the boxes and crane their head up into the vents. This prompted the idea of adding a small Easter egg to reward those players. Try it, and you'll find that the cheeky crab has indeed escaped to be annoying another day. The cost of adding these sorts of secrets needs to be weighed against the potential for players to actually discover them. In this case, our playtest observations made the cost appear worth it, in particular for the impact it would have in making the world feel more real, a full reality where living creatures go about their lives even if the player isn't there to witness them.
Alex, coming in. Hey, Alex. Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
More or less. You're breaking up.
I think you're still in the distillery.
I made a friend named Jeff.
Well, that's great. We can take all the help we can get.
Yeah, we're not really close.
Listen, there should be a big tunnel-sized plug in the floor there somewhere. That's gonna be...
The tunnel out of here?
Correct. You get it open, I'll figure out where it leads.
Since the entire premise of Jeff hinged on keeping Jeff and the player in close proximity to each other, the distillery map was constructed as a series of chambers connected by one-way transitions. Early on, we used two techniques in concert to keep Jeff and the player together throughout the level. First, each new area was gated with a special locked door. These took the form of impenetrable Zen membranes that only Jeff could tear through. The player would lure Jeff to the membrane using sound, and Jeff would break it open so that both Jeff and the player could proceed. We had always had a goal of having players describe Jeff in adversarial terms, as a constant pursuer or a thorn in their side. The problem with the Zen membrane concept was that it led to players describing Jeff as a useful tool, or worse, an angry co-op partner, rather than something they feared. Another way that we would keep Jeff and the player together was via the use of one-way drops. Jeff would fall off catwalks, platforms, and ladders into each new area. These drops functioned as intended, but just like the Zen membranes, elicited an undesirable reaction from players, especially when repeated multiple times. Watching Jeff do these pratfalls left players feeling like he was less dangerous. They felt sorry for him, and even laughed at him. Eventually, we realized that we could use combined force fields, which the player cannot pass through, as a way to create one-way doors. These force fields allowed Jeff to move through them, but required the player to follow via another one-way path. This allowed us to build thresholds where Jeff and the player could both move forward while eliminating the awkwardness of the Zen membranes, and avoiding the repeated falls that had previously made Jeff look so clumsy. Combined force fields also had a few other benefits. For one, they gave Jeff a convenient way to take a backstage route that is inaccessible to the player, like the one at the bottom of this ladder. They also tied in nicely with Jeff's fictional background as a former member of the Combine Zen cleanup crew.
Creating an experience with such a heavy focus on audio presented some unique design problems. The primary challenge was determining which sounds Jeff should be able to hear and making sure that players understood the rules. Half-Life Alyx contains a vast array of physics objects. However, through playtesting, we found it best to use only a small set of them in the distillery. We needed to pay close attention to each object that we did include, particularly to audio design for collisions between the object and the various surface types used in the distillery. It was important that what players heard matched their expectations for how Jeff would react. In early testing, we would find individual cases where players would say things like, "I don't know why Jeff got angry," or "I would have expected that noise to attract Jeff." Over time, we identified these cases of confusion and addressed them one by one. It was vital that players always be able to identify the cause and effect of a noise that might attract Jeff. Failing this meant players were left feeling like Jeff acted randomly and they'd grow frustrated. Some experiments failed in this area. At one point, parts of the level were littered with piles of broken glass that would make noise if the player walked or teleported over them. Few players would notice the broken glass and were then surprised when Jeff attacked, so this concept was cut to avoid confusion. We had to be wary of the opposite case too, where players would expect purely aesthetic elements to present a noise hazard. For example, at one point we had placed shallow pools of water seeping in among the floor tiles. It looked really cool, but it confused some of our playtesters who thought that the sound of their footsteps splashing through these puddles would be audible to Jeff, even though we never intended that to be the case.
Nicely done. And there we go.
Security alert. Reminder, ground team. Mission failure will result in permanent relocation. Response code, breach. Maneuver, inoculate.
What the hell is that?
That's Jeff. Keep your voice down.
Oh, okay. I don't like Jeff.
Figuring out how to end the player's journey through the distillery involved a lot of discussion about how players would ultimately end up feeling about Jeff. Observing playtests told us that most players simply wanted him dead, usually from the moment they met him, but there were some who felt kind of sorry for him and didn't necessarily want to see him killed. Our first version of the ending involved the player's actions unintentionally resulting in Jeff being attacked and dragged away by antlions. Part of the goal was to demonstrate that the antlions are even more powerful than Jeff, to amp up the tension just before players have to square off against antlions themselves. This ending left players feeling a little empty. They felt detached from Jeff's demise and wanted to be more directly involved. Dark stuff, to be sure. Plus, we weren't really servicing those players who felt sorry for Jeff and didn't necessarily want to see him killed.
There were other problems too. The antlion attack felt random to many players, which reduced its impact. And because Jeff presumably died off-screen, players were left without a sense of closure. This prevented players from being able to switch gears and settle in for their encounter with the antlions. The trash compactor was a solution to these problems. It gave players the opportunity to decide Jeff's fate and be left with a sense of closure whether they decided to squash him or just leave him imprisoned. Even so, it has to be admitted that most players seem to crush Jeff with zero hesitation. Monsters.
Jeff, are you okay?
Whoa, what did you do to Jeff?
Yeah, I trapped Jeff in a trash compactor. And then I crushed him.
God damn! Well, I hope you came across some of the good stuff. See you around.
Okay, the coast is clear. Time to get that plug open so we can get through those tunnels. That tunnel heads to the vault.
Great. Also, little heads up. I think the tunnel is full of antlions. Just in case I cut out permanently.
Antlions?
Yeah, you know, aliens with stabby legs.
Oh, yes, and very small, like ants.
No.
Like tiny little lions.
No, that's not them. These ones are pretty dangerous.
Right, well, whatever they are, they're down that tunnel.
Yep. Off I go. You know, I hope you appreciate how much of a pain in the butt it is carrying this vodka around.
Oh, you have gone above and beyond with what you've got there. It's reckless, excessive, and deeply appreciated.
Oh, I'm taking one of these for myself.
That's an antlion?
Yes. So you do know what antlions are?
Yes, they're leggies.
In some of our early experiments bringing Half-Life 2 enemies to VR, we found that antlions in particular showed promise and were interesting to fight, but tended to quickly overwhelm playtesters. They were able to get into the player's physical space too quickly, and applied so much pressure that players just ended up endlessly teleporting around trying to get away. Around the same time, we were discovering that all players, even relative novices, have surprisingly good aim in VR. The variability of aiming ability amongst players is simply much lower in VR than it is in mouse and keyboard games. To take advantage of the idea that players would consistently be able to make precise shots, we started testing an antlion design which players could slow down by shooting off the legs. Playtesters reacted positively to both the need for accuracy and the organic feeling that this gave the antlions when their legs flew off and the injured antlion continued to limp toward them. The removal of the legs was clear to players, but presenting the fact that the abdomen was invulnerable until the legs were removed was a long-standing challenge. There was no single solution to communicating this effectively to playtesters, but rather a series of small additions that communicated the behavior. For example, we made the abdomen dull and black when invulnerable, and changed it to match the bright orange legs as it became vulnerable. Shooting armored parts of the antlion would generate sparks and hard ricochet sounds, while shooting the vulnerable body parts resulted in orange blood spurts and soft impact sounds. We also designed the death animations to emphasize the abdomen exploding, and ensured that an exploded abdomen chunk was left behind after the antlion was dead.
Hey, any news on the data pod?
Your dad's head's down. He's working on it. He's got to be close.
Great.
All of the foliage in the game animates in response to player touch and environmental wind conditions. The foliage animation is entirely procedural and is computed on the graphics processor using vertex shader deformation. A voxel field that travels with the player's body is used to track the location of the player's hands in space. The hands effectively draw motion trails into this voxel field, which can be sampled by the foliage's vertex shader and used to drive deformations, allowing the player to bat the foliage around with their hands. The foliage also interacts with wind, allowing us to give ambient motion to the plants. In order to accommodate a range of environmental design, we tuned the wind deformations at different speeds, from slight drafts to hurricane force winds. It turned out, though, that the ambient wind was never required to be more than a moderate breeze, and for most of development, the hurricane effect was unused. This particular zoo habitat was added late in development and required a critical extension to the procedural foliage animation system. Prior to adding this habitat, the foliage didn't need to deform in response to enemy animation or grenade explosions, but of course, this area is all about throwing grenades at zombies. To address this, we added a low-resolution voxel field that can be sampled by the foliage shader to apply additional deformations. This low-resolution voxel field, which is about 1 cubic foot per voxel, is fixed in space and spans the entire habitat. For comparison, the voxel field that travels with the player is about 2 cubic inches per voxel. Enemies and grenades within this space can write motion trails and impacts into the low-resolution voxel field, which are ultimately interpreted by the foliage shader as wind forces. This is when preparation met opportunity. When grenades explode, they are creating localized hurricane force winds.
I got something.
What is it?
Yeah. What is it, Dad?
It doesn't look like they actually built the weapon. It's like they, I don't know, discovered something. Or maybe they uncovered it.
What do you mean?
If I'm reading this right, they tracked it to an old apartment building in the QZ, but instead of going in to get it, they grabbed the whole building and built a vault.
There were very few existing antlion sounds to work with coming into Half-Life Alyx. So unlike most of the familiar Half-Life creatures, which often had legacy sounds layered in, nearly all of the sounds for the antlions were completely new material. Starting with an almost blank canvas, we drew inspiration from the behavior of the antlions to inform their sound design. Since the antlions attack in waves, it seemed reasonable to us that they communicated and organized into groups for attack. This idea led us to incorporate complex insect-like clicking sounds, the final version of which began as recordings of European starlings, which turned out to provide more variation and character than insect recordings. Here you can hear the original European starling sounds. We took those recordings and layered them with designed elements to create the antlion sounds used in the game.
Last one.
In traditional games, analog controls like levers, dials, and crank wheels usually play simple animations in response to a player's mouse click or key press. In VR, however, players with tracked hand controllers expect to be able to control analog interfaces by grabbing and moving them directly. To support this, we developed a new system that we call Anim Interactables. The opening mechanism of this health station is a good example of an Anim Interactable. To your left and right, you can see some more examples, such as a large railroad switch, the Vortigaunt's fire alarm doorbell, a crank wheel, a rolling cabinet door, and both the antenna and tuning dial on the radio. Anim Interactables like these allow us to give the player control of analog interfaces while constraining their input to an authored range of motion. The system uses the position and orientation of the player's hand to drive the animation of a model which defines the analog interface. As the player moves their tracked controller, the Anim Interactable continuously performs a search to determine if playing the animation forward or backward will place the interaction point closer to the tracked controller's position in space. This allows the player to drag the animation forward, backward, or hold it stationary. The result is an intuitive correspondence between the player's body and the virtual interface. Furthermore, these interactive animations don't necessarily have to make physical sense. Artists simply animate the range of motion they want the player to be able to control. These Anim Interactables have their debug visualizations turned on, so you can see the authored range of motion, including the nonlinear paths used on the railroad switch, the health station, and the crank wheel. Anim Interactables allowed us to make all kinds of objects in the world interactive, from mundane man-made devices to intricate combine mechanisms, without the need to run complex physical simulations. Feel free to play around with the Anim Interactables in this area before moving on.
Wait, Dad, what?
It's not a vault. It's a prison. They didn't build it to keep us out. They're trying to keep something in.
Keep what in?
I don't know.
Sometimes large chunks of a level are shifted around or reordered as we work on the game. That's the case for this entire area and the toner puzzle it's centered around. In fact, for much of its existence, this area didn't even have a home anywhere in the game. It was originally built just to help prototype the toner puzzle mechanic. Over the course of a few months, the raw gameplay mechanics of toner puzzles were developed and playtested in a series of small test levels. Each test level explored a single gameplay concept. Those were things like using the toner puzzle to draw the player's eyes to something interesting, such as Zen flora and fauna, creating moments of surprise when an enemy head crab popped out of a vent, or requiring the player to thread their arm and hand in behind pipes or other tight spaces. Once we figured out which of these ideas were working well, we combined them into a single test level with the toner puzzle that strung all these concepts together in one single puzzle. Further playtesting in this level made us confident that toner puzzles should be included in the game, and we started adding them into other areas. But we didn't include the test level itself anywhere in the game. It wasn't until later that it became apparent that the zoo was in need of a pace break. We pay careful attention to player fatigue when we playtest, and look for cases where a puzzle or some exploration and resource gathering can be used to give the player a break from combat. There was such a need toward the end of the zoo level, and thankfully in this case we were able to make use of the toner prototype level that had already been built.
When we decided to resurrect our toner prototype level for use as a pacing break in the zoo, we had the opportunity to make some improvements and integrate elements that hadn't existed when we had first experimented with the toner mechanic. For example, the newly developed explosive Zen bloaters were added at various points along the puzzle to surprise players and remind them that they need to keep an eye out for these hazards. Also, in the intervening months, the toner mechanic itself had evolved from one where players merely push a ball of energy along a path to one which included branching paths and rotating junctions. This junction here in the breaker box is the linchpin of the whole puzzle, as the player must interact with it 3 times. Once to open the roller door to this back area, once to switch power away from the roller door to the last leg of the puzzle, and once to reopen the roller door in order to exit. Because this toner puzzle covers such a large physical area, including some zombie combat in the middle, players frequently lost track of the correspondence between the state of this junction and the roller door. This meant that they would trap themselves back here and not understand how to proceed. To address this, we made a lot of changes to the presentation of this junction over the course of development.
The unique breaker box and tangle of conduit are designed to make the junction recognizable as the same junction from both sides of the wall. The shape of the hole in the wall and the orientation of the breaker box are designed to make sure that the player stands in the right location to have line of sight to the roller door and see that it closes when they route power away from it to the last leg of the puzzle. The door itself also makes a lot of noise and an unreasonable amount of sparks to draw attention to itself each time it moves. This particular puzzle twist was in danger of being cut for a long time, but with this series of refinements, enough playtesters understood its behavior that we were comfortable with shipping it in the final game.
Last one. They're locking down the area.
Good luck trying to lock out someone wielding an Alex.
Emergence from the zoo gave us an opportunity to present players with a dramatic vista and to show them how much progress they had made in the journey to the vault. This was challenging because the vault's position in the world was already determined to be above the parking garage, which the player would reach at the end of the map. But placing the vault correctly in support of that location left the vault looking too distant to create the dramatic view we wanted here. We also intended to portray the cutting of the vault's power cables by the Vortigunts at this point, but having this take place at such a distant location was unclear and confused playtesters. The solution was to move everything closer. The vault looked more imposing looming above the player, and the effects of the Vortigunts' cable cutting efforts were much clearer. All we needed then was a conceit to justify the two vault locations, the location here at the start of the map and the eventual location at the end of the map. Around this same phase of development, we were in the process of defining exactly how the player would bring down the vault, and our solution to that problem also helped justify the two vault locations. Tractor beams are a familiar cliché in science fiction and often share a common visual style of an enveloping force field emitted net-like from a single point. Using a tractor beam as a combined failsafe device to catch the vault served us well here. It allowed us to prevent Alex from being crushed by the vault dropped out of the sky when the Vortigunts cut the final power cable, and it gave us a satisfactory mechanism for moving the vault to the location we need it to be at the end of the map. Throughout the map, the beam itself also serves as a beacon, ensuring that the players are always able to recognise their new goal, the tractor beam control station.
There's somebody up there.
That's not Combine. Maybe a scavenger? Be careful. Eli, come here!
What is it, Russell?
Listen to this.
Whoa, whoa. Shh.
Okay, well, go get them. You took over the entire planet in 7 hours.
The final twist of the game presented quite a few storytelling challenges for the writers. The game is long, much longer than a movie, and the surprise reveal of the G-Man at the end felt almost impossible to sustain over the entire experience. Everyone on the team assumed that through basic deduction, most players are going to figure it out along the way. So the solution, like in most good stories, was to just add more stuff, more details, more questions, and more nooks and crannies to the plot. The writers quickly realized that there was one big distracting name, Gordon Freeman, that would pull the players' attention away from any theories they may be cooking up on their own. We then realized that we could use the absence of the G-Man in the story, in the eerie parallels between the G-Man and Gordon's experiences at Black Mesa, to redirect player attention and propel the story towards the final act. If the player thought they had uncovered a new mission to save Gordon Freeman from stasis, then the twist at the end could be secure. To pull it off, the writers created a new, mysterious character, a scientist collaborating with the Combine. This addition came late in the project, so the writers relied on another tried-and-true tact. Base the character on an actor we're fond of, and then do our absolute best to cast and record with that person. The chosen actor had struck a particular tone with the writers. She has an easy, in-command confidence, and a smooth southern Missouri drawl. This not only sets her apart from the other characters in the Half-Life universe, but makes the character easy to hear on the page, which is incredibly important when time is short at the end of the project. And once she was in the studio, her pitch-perfect performance assured us that we'd made the correct decision. Of course, then the scene still had to be built. Level designers figured out what existing chunk of level track could be bumped out to fit the scene. The area we chose previously held some barnacles and a few light puzzle elements, which the designers weren't upset to lose. The level track had to be altered to funnel you into a place where the scene could unfold and the player could eavesdrop without getting a good look at the character. This served two purposes. One was that it would benefit the mystery for the scene to feel furtive and for the identity of the character to remain secret. But also, we could shroud the performance and the intricate facial animation necessary to bring a character to life, all in shadow, for the animators and the choreographers. Like in a lot of cases, not doing the work was the correct thing for both the story and our tight shipping schedule.
The purpose of this hideout was to give players a nice reward for being observant and exploring the environment. We wanted to highlight the story of scavengers living behind the quarantine wall, what their lives might look like, and why they might choose to live there. The person who lived here was referred to internally as the Combine Killer, imagined as a person with a grudge against the Combine who has chosen to eke out a living in the quarantine zone, spending their time exacting revenge on unsuspecting Combine patrols, perhaps eventually joining the organized resistance movement portrayed in Half-Life 2.
Once we get Gordon back, we can really get ambitious, don't you think, Russ? Maybe we could take down the Citadel.
Well, he saved humanity once. I'm willing to bet he can do it again.
And this time he won't have to do it alone.
In recent years, video game streaming has become one of the main ways that players engage with the culture of games, and this is even more true for VR titles, where players who do not have VR equipment want to participate. To address this audience, we created a Spectator Hud, which displays the VR player's health, ammunition, resin, and the contents of their wrist pockets. This information is overlaid on the 3D scene in the desktop window, and lets viewers track the state of the player's resources, without having to rely on the player to look at their wrist or open up a menu. The Spectator HUD started off as a tool used by the development team to display resources, as well as the state of controller buttons and other diagnostic information. An interesting side effect of this HUD was that it made playtests way more exciting to watch, because we as an audience had information the player wasn't necessarily aware of. For example, playtest observers might realize that a player had barely survived an encounter when the players themselves had never even checked their health. We even saw cases where players killed an enemy with their very last bullet without realizing it themselves. The highs and lows we felt watching our own playtests were something that we wanted to share with the streaming audience, and it's been exciting to see streamers using it in the wild.
Russ, what do you think they're doing to Gordon Freeman in there?
That's a good question.
Are they, sucking his brain out?
I think they're gonna move him off-world.
Well, either way, let's not find out. I'll get there before it happens. Russ, what's the deal with the crowbar?
Oh, you mean Gordon Freeman's crowbar?
Yeah.
Oh, Alex!
Creating a climactic battle that capped off the antlion combat proved to be a challenging design problem. We wanted to create a sustained combat experience that was substantial enough to challenge players who had refined their skills against the antlions. But simply throwing a large number of antlions at the player all at once was not a particularly engaging experience, nor was it compatible with our established combat balancing. Rather than containing the player in a restricted space and spawning waves of enemies, we wanted to keep the player engaged and moving through a gauntlet of constant pressure toward a goal. To do this, we needed an arena with a clear linear flow and a porous layout that would allow the player to maintain sight of their goal while being flanked by swarms of antlions as they move toward it. This tanker yard, which we had originally built for a narrative scene that was cut from the game, had the properties we were looking for. The long tanker cars lead toward the intended direction of travel, and their positioning requires the player to pay careful attention to their sides and rear as they advance. The combine tractor beam tower is framed at the end of the tracks, providing a clear goal for the player. The placement of the glowing red sign in the direction of the tractor beam was also a deliberate decision, a technique used by the environment artist to subconsciously pull players in the desired direction via visual contrast, even in the event that they've momentarily lost their bearings in the chaos of the battle. The pacing of the combat here was carefully balanced to leave most playtesters on the brink of being overwhelmed and feeling like they made it through by just the skin of their teeth. It took many iterations of enemy placement, ammo and item placement, and player path adjustments to achieve this balance. We ultimately settled on a design that featured a steady stream of advancing antlions, with antlion spitters placed at the far end of the space applying enough pressure to prevent players from rushing toward the goal. Combine soldiers up on the raised platforms divert player attention to the right-hand flank and provide verticality and target prioritization, adding to the sense of frenzy we sought to create.
One left. Mount. Three left. Swap in here?
Yeah, no, I would probably die instantly.
The goal of this puzzle was to create a moment of heightened stress by requiring players to deal with a sudden threat after being placed in a precariously disadvantageous position. In the original design of the puzzle, players would stand on a platform which was suspended from a cable and pull themselves across the chasm. Halfway across, antlion spitters would emerge and start attacking. The platform provided limited cover, and players would have to make trade-offs between taking cover and continuing to propel themselves forward. This succeeded in creating the desired spike in intensity, but unfortunately, the lateral movement of the platform caused considerable motion sickness for most playtesters. Even players who were comfortable with the vertical movement of elevators elsewhere in the game were adversely affected here. The puzzle that we shipped retains the same sense of tension due to being stranded in the middle of a chasm under attack, but does not rely on physically moving the player. The upper portion of the wooden platform is deliberately devoid of any substantial cover, which encourages players to jump onto the platforms below. On the lower platforms, we provide enough cover to protect players from antlions, but also leave them feeling vulnerable out in the middle of the chasm. The cover here is porous and breakable, increasing the sense of urgency and requiring players to engage the antlions from their compromised position.
Alex, we're getting close to the vault now. You're not going to have many more chances to use your resin.
Good point. I'll see if there are any upgrades I can use.
I can't believe my pistol's made it this far.
I was thinking about giving it to Gordon. Three cells left. Three shells left.
In cases where the player had to face off against Combine in relatively open spaces like this one, we often found that playtesters would backtrack to safety and attempt to pick away at the soldiers from a distance. The playtesters would ultimately be successful in clearing the combat space, but would feel unsatisfied with the encounter due to the repetitive and static nature of the tactics that they employed. To address this, we used a few design tools to discourage this type of player behavior. The placement of the Combine suppressor, standing on the bed of the truck at the far end of the courtyard here, is the key to the design flow of this battle. The suppressor does not move from his planted position on the far side of the courtyard while the player is on the near side. His positioning, combined with his unrelenting wall of suppressing fire, forces the player to advance in order to close the distance required to take him out, all while under the intense pressure from a carefully crafted combination of other Combine units. Additionally, if the player backtracks far enough from the fight, the more mobile Combine soldiers in the encounter are told to retreat and hold their ground until the player once again advances into the combat. These elements together keep players moving forward into locations that provide for more interesting opportunities for both the player and the enemy soldiers.
After the intense combat that precedes it, this tower initially serves as a pacing break, before once again ramping up the intensity on the player's final fight up to the Combine tractor beam controls. While the lower portion of the tower does contain combat, it has been designed to cause players to engage with the space in a different way than the preceding courtyard fight. The focus here is on navigating the chaotic verticality of the tower, which we found to be particularly successful for playtesters to experience in VR. The manhacks that initially engage the player from above fly a path that deliberately has them crashing around the pipes and boards overhead, causing sparks and splinters to rain down on the player. Combined with the disorienting nature of the space, the Combine suppressor that emerges at the top of the stairwell is used to reintroduce an appropriate level of intensity and to create a sense of a struggle as the player continues to scramble closer to their goal.
There's the control room.
I see it. We're almost there.
Alex, you there?
Yeah, Dad?
It looks like you will be able to get into the vault from up there. There's a terminal that extends a bridge to the entrance.
What's the security like inside?
I got it all laid out in front of me, and I tell you, there is security. But I've never seen anything like it. It doesn't make any sense.
I guess I'll have to improvise.
At the start of the previous map, we introduced the tractor beam, a failsafe device used to catch the falling vault when the last substation was knocked offline. In this location, a console looks like it could be used to control the tractor beam to dock the vault for entry via the nearby gantry on the left. We decided to have the vault crash to the ground spectacularly, but for this to work emotionally, we needed the scene to increase in tension beforehand. The whole vault docking console is absurd by design. If the console appeared too much like a legitimate puzzle, playtesters could take too long and let the air out of the scene, unsure if there was something that they could actually solve. The more inscrutable the machine looked, the more likely they were to interact with the levers and play along with the unfolding disaster. The first phase of the puzzle extends the catwalk and unlocks the main lever bank, which responds to the player's input, engaging them in the solution. Every subsequent lever thrown does nothing except increase the tension as things continue to go wrong. The back-and-forth radio dialogue between Alex and Russell completes the scene with growing panic and keeps players in the moment, flipping levers in an attempt to save the vault.
All right, here we go. Time to go rescue the savior of humanity.
You know, honey, you haven't been doing too bad yourself. Earth could have used you in the 7-Hour War.
Maybe we'd have lasted 8. All right. Looks like the bridge is fully extended. Just need to gently dock the vault to the bridge. How hard can that be? Oh god. Okay, well, one of these has to bring in the vault for docking. Right? Right?
Almost certainly. Just pick one! Immediately!
baby.
Alex, please, just pick one. No, not that one. Alex, the bridge isn't moving. Why isn't the bridge not moving?
I know. Russ, I can see it not moving. Definitely not. That doesn't look good. Ugh. Oh god!
Alex! Alex! Alex? Alex? Alex, are you okay?
I think I just killed Gordon Freeman.
The vault's right there. Just go in and get him.
5 years ago, we placed playtesters beneath an idling Half-Life 2 Strider. It was a really simple prototype, but the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. This experience convinced us we should pursue a Strider encounter in VR. And as a result, we built dozens of prototypes over the next few years. Some designs pressed playtesters into very close contact with the Strider. Some had a Strider chase them through a simple environment, or shoot at them through porous cover. In other cases, the Strider would destroy a wall the player was hiding behind or give a performance the player was meant to observe. A prototype built in 2017 squared the player directly off with a Strider in a quarry, combining many of our ideas into one experience. Based on the success of this prototype, the team moved on to building the shipping experience ahead of you, although it would take another 3 years of refinement to complete. Each iteration brought us a new set of rules and players' expectations. The Strider encounter ahead is a carefully crafted collection of beats shaped by our own ideas of what would be exciting and fun, refined over a long period of playtesting.
Through many iterations of the Strider encounter, we would find ourselves having functionally solved a problem, only to realize that we also had to fictionally contextualize the solution so that it made sense. For example, we designed this entire map to include combat with Combine soldiers. But how should we fictionally place them in this destroyed space? How could we put a disabled Strider close to the player? What were the Combine doing here prior to the vault collapse? This soldier was placed here to communicate to the player that some Combine were in the area investigating an antlion infestation before the vault fell on them. In fact, you can see some dead antlions nearby. If you listen closely, you'll hear the soldier trying to contact the rest of his squad, letting the player know that they are not alone and that there is likely to be more combat ahead.
Taking fire.
Although we could excuse a few random combine in this area left over from investigating the antlion infestation, we needed a way to justify the large squads of combine in the combat encounters that occur later in the level. These 2 combine are part of a squad sent down looking for survivors after the vault collapse, and their dialogue is designed to inform the player that this strider they have found may not be dead. Fictionally, it is the player's combat with these 2 soldiers that alerts the rest of the combine in this area to the player's presence.
A strider! Deactivated though. Whew, lucky
For many
break there.
players,
Could you
striders are the
imagine
most
that
feared
thing
and powerful enemies in the Half-Life franchise, and we thought it would be interesting to flip player expectations on their head and experience what it would feel like to team up and cooperate with a strider. Our initial concept was inspired by Aesop's fable of the lion and the mouse, with the player freeing a disabled strider who would later help the player escape by clearing the way forward. Initially, the parking garage was a combine silo, and it was much easier fictionally to have some type of combine device which could constrain a strider without injury. When the location changed to a collapsed parking garage, we constrained the strider by trapping it in the elevator shaft, held down by the elevator car. After being freed, the injured strider would lash out at anything nearby, combine and player alike, as it tried to escape. This was a strong story when told aloud, but expressing it in a way that was understood by players turned out to be difficult. Keeping the strider around throughout the level, alternating between injured and angry states as the player slowly picked their way through the garage, was confusing to playtesters, and we had a very hard time trying to find the right balance. Playtesting feedback was really consistent around this. So although we loved the idea, we let it go in favor of a more straightforward and achievable dynamic of hunter and prey that eventually shipped. The year we spent pursuing the lion and a mouse idea wasn't wasted, however, as we created and refined many of the different story beats that shipped. We also crafted some performances and technology that led to the success of the final experience.
The Strider encounter boils down to a set of performances and the Strider's AI-driven minigun. Maintaining the illusion that the Strider was aware of and hunting the player while delivering these performances required a delicate coordination between animation and AI systems. We used a variety of approaches to make the Strider feel like an intelligent creature hunting the player.
Players in VR move very slowly by first-person shooter standards, so we have the Strider alternate between chasing performances, following the player through the level, and then hunting performances, focused on tracking and firing at the player, or looking for them. Triggering the different stages of this pursuit took a lot of playtesting. We paid close attention to how playtesters would move through the level and then built the triggers and iterated on the animations to support the most common behaviors. It was very much a back and forth conversation to evolve a beat into something that most players would believe the Strider was truly hunting them. Early playtesters would grow weary of being shot at without any downtime or contrasting experiences. So we identified the beats that would create that contrast and layer them in when we saw playtesters become fatigued. Things like the Strider bashing the wall, walking over you, chasing you up an elevator shaft, all acted as ways to break up the experience and surprise the player. Whenever we had feedback a playtester was growing or looked bored or fatigued, we would brainstorm different ways to insert these beats, and then test it to verify that they were paced correctly. One of the tools we used was a sophisticated look-at system on the Strider. The system tracked the player and would procedurally orient different parts of the Strider to face the player. The body, minigun, and Gauss cannon all had different look-ats to break up the effect when the Strider lost or acquired the player. These could be independently enabled or disabled at specific times to make it feel like the Strider was directly addressing the player. In each animation of the sequence, the look-at on the minigun and body would be enabled or disabled based on whether the Strider should be able to see the player at that point.
It was important to communicate clearly to the player that they were being hunted by the Strider at this point. We wanted players to see the Strider dust itself off and fixate on them, so that there would be no doubt that they were now the prey. This elevator ride was a useful tool to achieve this, as it is one of the few moments of the game that we have a captive audience. The elevator door facing the Strider was carefully designed to provide enough protection, so that players would feel safe, but enough visibility to see the Strider's performance.
During development, we talked a lot about the experience of the Strider minigun blasting through the walls and floors of the parking garage while hunting the player, but we weren't sure we would be able to deliver Destructible cover until around 6 months prior to shipping. To address this, we designed the Destructible cover to visually communicate that it was being broken down prior to actually fracturing and breaking. Initially, the cover would look like an unremarkable piece of concrete or other building material, but when it took sufficient damage, it would start to visibly crack and throw off dust particles. When the same piece of cover took further damage, it would then fracture into pre-cut physics objects and generate more dust and debris particles. Through playtesting, we determined how much damage the cover should be able to take before breaking down and forcing the player to move. In the end, the Destructible cover system allowed us to deliver on our goal of giving players the impression that the Strider was capable of tearing through the parking garage with its minigun as it pursued them.
In this area of the map, we began hearing from some playtesters that they found the minigun firing monotonous. Originally, the gun would fire at a set rate, regardless of the player's behavior. To address the monotony, we made several improvements to the Strider AI running just the minigun. The minigun will fire if it sees the player, but take a moment to acquire them. Play an acquired sound to warn them they have locked on, and then stitch the bullets towards the player in its first volley. The minigun volleys themselves were broken up to become more staccato, with random intervals in between volleys. If the player ducks behind cover, the Strider will keep firing where it last saw the player for a short period. These changes to the minigun behavior eliminated the monotony and gave players the impression that they were fleeing a living creature.
To keep the Strider engagement interesting throughout the level, we knew that we wanted to challenge the player's understanding of what the Strider was capable of. We identified this upcoming room as a space where most players felt they understood the Strider's capabilities and built this next beat to surprise them. To create the doorframe bash moment, we used the Strider's animation to drive an offline destruction simulation that could be played back by the game engine in real time. We coupled this with particle effects and physics impulses on interactive physics objects in the room to make the player feel unsafe. To fully sell the idea that the Strider has been searching for and has found the player, we gave the Strider a moment of pause after tearing away the wall to look at the player before it started to fire again.
Playtesting the Strider encounter, we learned that players enjoyed fighting a challenging enemy but responded negatively if they took damage in a way that seemed unfair. To address this, we used audio to communicate the state of the Strider. For example, when the Strider did not have line of sight to the player, it would emit a periodic hunting sound. This sound was meant to communicate to the player that they were currently safe, but that the Strider was still there. Once the Strider had seen the player, it would switch to its chasing state and make corresponding chasing sounds. When the Strider was ready to start firing at the player, it would emit a target-acquired sound before firing. Players quickly learned this pattern of sound cues, and no longer complained about being caught unaware of the Strider's targeting state.
Last 3. One.
We needed to familiarize the player with the Strider's Gauss cannon firing sequence, so they'd be able to recognize it when they saw it again later in the map. This particular area of the map went through a lot of iteration, as we searched for ways to reliably place the player in the right spot, at the right time, looking at the right thing, the Gauss cannon, as it charged up and fired. To achieve this, we ultimately settled on using a two-handed roller door. It requires the player to stand in a specific position and orientation, and occupies their hand so we know they aren't teleporting or interacting with anything else. We even know the precise moment that the door clears their eye line, so we can be assured that they're going to see what we want them to see.
Russell, speed gun, up ahead.
When the central theme of this map was the lion and the mouse, the encounter with the Strider ended at this point. The Strider simply exited off into the sunset. We intended for the Strider to reappear in a subsequent fight, perhaps even attacking the Combine alongside the player. But this idea was only pursued briefly before being cut. The problem was that playtesters felt cheated that they didn't get to destroy the Strider after being hunted and harassed by it for so long. In the final map, once the player steps into the rat maze below, the Strider reappears and begins hunting the player again. Because Alex does not possess any weapons that can damage the Strider, we explored a variety of ways that the player could take out the Strider using something found in the environment. These included ideas like triggering missiles on a downed Combine helicopter, using a Combine mortar emplacement, or kicking off some type of physics event to sweep the Strider's legs out and kill it. We built prototypes of many of these ideas, and eventually narrowed down to the mounted gun solution that shipped. It was simple, repeatable, and was one of the easier solutions to train under fire.
In this sequence, we wanted the player to end the encounter by killing the Strider in a dramatic boss fight using a weapon found in the environment. This meant that we had to introduce a new weapon which was more powerful than the player's equipped weapons, and which had to remain in the environment after the fight. A mounted gun on an abandoned Combine vehicle makes no sense, and after some initial tests with the downed Combine helicopter repurposed from Half-Life 2, we settled on the armored personnel carrier, since one had already been built for use in another section of the game. Since the gun mechanism itself would be seen for the first time while under pressure from the Strider, it had to have an aiming and firing mechanism that the player would understand immediately. We prototyped a variety of designs, from a machine gun that auto-fired as soon as the player grabbed the handle, to a gun that fired a sticky bomb that had to be detonated by the player after it hit its target. The auto-firing machine gun was too simple to use and lacked dramatic effect, and the extra interaction required to detonate the sticky bomb was too much to teach the player while under duress. We settled on a design that requires one hand to aim and another to both reload and fire. Requiring the player to push the firing mechanism all the way forward to reload was necessary to prevent the player from firing too rapidly. The gun's shell reloading animation is directly driven by the player's motion and communicates to the player that they must move their hand all the way forward to reload before being able to pull it back to fire.
Whoa, yeah, okay. Going up.
It's throwing off a lot of interference. I might not be able to talk to you in there.
No, probably not.
So, this is it.
Yeah.
And then you'll come out with Gordon, safe and sound, so everything is gonna be...
Everything will be fine, Russ. Talk to you soon.
What? Why?
Dad? Dad? Okay, this is weird. But, I don't know, it doesn't look too dangerous.
As the player enters the vault and is immersed in its warped reality, they lose contact with Russell. With Russell no longer available to explain what the player was seeing, we had to communicate the important concepts of the vault through the use of visual effects, physics, sound design, and music. The most important concept was that the errant bursts of uncontrolled energy causing anti-reality events was spillover of the Vortigaunt energy being used to keep the prisoner in the vault, as his influence occasionally gained the upper hand through cracks in the field. Starting from the vault crash in the prior map, we used this piece of musical sound design to represent the newly uncontrolled Vortigaunt energy being released from the vault. And this piece to accompany the reality-bending bursts caused and swayed by the G-Man's increasing reach. Within the vault, we repeat these motifs to reinforce the Vortigaunt energy mechanic that the player is ultimately able to use as a weapon against the Combine, short circuit to release the prisoner, save Eli, and complete the game. earliest days of the story design, the audio team established a corresponding aesthetic plan that employed increasingly strange sound design, soundscapes, and music, culminating in a soundscape appropriate to the broken reality of the vault and Alex's encounter with the G-Man. While the vault level was being designed, it became apparent that the accompanying music would be crucial to selling the surreal nature of the vault. Most music in the vault is based on the musical palindrome you hear in the Sideways room. By utilizing variations of elements in this piece and warping them with multiple types of pitch and time bending, we created an appropriately abstract sonority. While strange and dislocating, it was still consistent unto itself, as well as conceptually relevant to the multidimensional nature of the G-Man and the Vortigaunt energy imprisoning him.
Half-Life Alyx was set in a realistic type world with familiar rules. The G-Man's presence in the vault gave us fictional justification to experiment with different distortions of reality and embrace surrealism in these spaces. Early experiments with gravity anomalies and distorting spatial expectations were promising as the immersiveness of VR worked to exaggerate their impact. The surreal environments proved to be fertile for puzzle solving as well, but they tended to stall the pacing at the point in the game we needed it to be ramping up, so they weren't included in the final release. The most notable of these was in the mirrored apartment. Players originally had to spot and correct differences between the top and bottom apartment spaces in order to escape that area. Instead of surreal interactive puzzles, the first half of the vault became a journey through an increasingly bizarre set of spaces that were once the apartment building the G-Man was captured in. Supercharging the Russells with Vorticon energy helped us achieve the goal of having an unarmed player overpower the last few Supercharging the Russells with Vorticon energy helped us achieve the goal of having an unarmed player overpower the last few Combine soldiers that were guarding the G-Man. Initially, grenades and a zero-gravity hallway was how we achieved this. Separately, we'd been experimenting with using the Russells to pull and throw energy bolts from Vorticon energy nodes. This was a natural fit for the Vault combat section since it evokes the concept of supercharging the gravity gun at the end of Half-Life 2 and works with the player's well-mastered Russells throwing mechanic. This new mechanic was introduced at a point where pacing was critical, so it had to be intuitive to pick up and quick to master. Giving the player the Vorticon energy attack not only helped to tie together that this was Vorticon energy containing the demon, but helped to further solidify the deep Vorticon connection to Alex. It also gave the player a chance to briefly feel like they had superpowers and be able to use that ability in a visceral, deeply physical way that's impossible in real life.
Let's get you out of this thing.